down and around the cliff. They entered a long tunnel that opened up into a cave, where the only sound was a low, resonant hum, like a finger running over a water glass. Veins of exotic ore shimmered in the walls, staining everything a crystalline blue. In the cave's upper reaches, glides swam through in the air in lazy circles, occasionally breaking that peaceful sound with his distant, mournful cry. Haters gonna hate. And at the back was a door, easily 10 feet wide and twice as tall, blue-gray like the sea, its edges marked with undecipherable symbols. Sans stopped just outside the tunnel's mouth, eyed that door, and then took out his notebook. You been here before, kid? He glanced aside to catch Frisk's nod. Yeah, figured. Ever get this door open? Frisk shook his head. Figured that too. The thing's an enigma. There's an old legend that says it'll open to someone who shows extraordinary gratitude, but I don't exactly have the time to bake it a birthday cake, so we're gonna try something a little less subtle today. He flipped open the notebook. I don't know where it goes normally, but for the next, about 16 minutes or so, I think, it'll lead somewhere else. It won't be in the underground. It won't be anywhere at all, empirically speaking. And that's where we'll find Gaster. Frisk peeked around Sans and saw that the first several pages of the notebook were covered with tally marks. The pages were crinkled, torn, spotted with dried ketchup. After the tally, the next page was blank, save for a single sentence in its center, written in a sharp-edged print unlike Sans' usual loopy scribble. Is it raining somewhere else? As Sans flipped through the pages, Frisk saw other things. Graphs that seemed to feed into themselves, and equations that made his eyes water. Maps of places he thought he recognized, but with extra rooms. X's scratched into unfamiliar places. A sketch of Frisk himself. It was quite well drawn, with an X scribbled over his mouth, and underneath the scrawled words. Don't trust him. Several more pages were filled entirely with the letter G, written over and over again until the paper was nearly black with charcoal. 2 more pages contained only the words, "Why not?" slashed into the paper with such force that it appeared Sans' pencil had snapped. Then, one variable at a time, the equations returned, and Sans started muttering to himself. Alright, let's see what we can see. Minimum 50 units, max indeterminate, that's good. Means I can redline it without worrying too much. Say 0.75 units per second considering drop-off. Then you factor in the KR effect. Maybe a minute and a half sustained. Yeah, go ahead and live dangerously. Sans replaced the notebook and stepped into the main cavern. He slowly rotated his head and shoulders. Various joints popped like firecrackers. Man, it's been a while. He looked over his shoulder. You want to see something cool? What Frisk saw nearly made him run out of the cave. He took a step back, then held his ground. Sans' eye burned. His right eye remained the same as ever, that dark hole with its white pinprick pupil, but now light blue and yellow flames licked around the left socket, and at its core was a solid sphere that printed a strobing circle of color on the far wall. Sans' immobile grin was bathed in that neon glare. Sans said, "Determination." Frisk crept closer to the flame. It gave no heat. You probably know by now that we monsters can't handle determination like humans can. Our souls don't generate it easily. Pump us full of the stuff and we'll just melt. But there's a theory. If a monster manages to become determined enough and hang around at that peak, point just before their body falls apart, all sorts of neat stuff can happen. Frisk cautiously touched his own eye. Sorry, kiddo, but comparing your determination threshold to mine's like comparing Mount Ebbet to an anthill. This trick is monster only. He turned back to the door. And besides, it's just a theory. I mean, I'm not determined. I'm just doing this to pass the time in between all your resets. I don't care about helping you at all. Sans' slipper scuffed across the ground. He raised one hand. It arrived without fanfare. Frisk blinked and then it was hanging over Sans like it had been there all along, casting its grim silhouette on the ground below. bone white, many-seamed, with ram horns curling across half its length. It resembled the DT extractor, that same ghastly goat skull. Its eyes and mouth were full of shadow. See how little I care? Sans flung his hand forward and the skull's eyes burned the same color as his own. Its jaw split along its seams. 1, 2, 3, and erupted with a raging white beam of light that crackled like a dynamo and struck the door dead center. Frisk cringed and held both arms over his eyes, but the light was so bright it passed right through his flesh. He could almost see his bones and sinew like looking at an X-ray. And as the beam burned into the door, that cool blue color seemed to leach away from it, leaving the stone cold and gray. The color drained from the walls as well, leaving only symbols etched in blue. Astrological signs, open palms, squares, diamonds, knots, and crosses. Glide retreated so far up the cave that he nearly concussed himself on the ceiling. The commotion went on for almost 2 minutes, and when the beam finally died and the skull winked out of reality once again, the whole cave had gone monochrome, save for the medley of symbols in the stones. Light spilled out from under the door, and with a great grinding of stone, it swung open. On the other end was a solid wall of white. There, all done. He turned around, stared at Frisk, then reached out and gently closed his hanging jaw. Guess you enjoyed the show, huh?
It was rad,
Glide called. Thanks, dude. He held out his hand to Frisk. So, ready? Frisk waited a moment for his ears to stop ringing and the aggravating bluish glare to bleed out of his vision, and then nodded and took Sans's hand. Fair warning, kid. We're breaking some serious science here. All bets are off when we step through that door. Stick close to me. They approached that blinding light together. Their shadows grew and leapt until they were imprinted on the entire back wall of the cave, silhouettes hand in hand. Then Sans stopped walking. One more thing, while we're bearing our hearts to each other. He faced forward. Dr. Gaster's my big brother. Frisk said nothing. Just, look, you don't owe me anything. But if you can, try to make this the last one, all right? I don't know what's going to happen in there, but I don't want to forget it. He felt pressure on his hand. Frisk had folded his own palm over it and squeezed tight. He nodded up at Sans. Appreciate it, Frisk. They stepped over the threshold. The light consumed them, and several minutes later, the door rasped shut. Color bled back into the cave, and the symbols along the walls faded once again into anonymity. It was a white and soundless place. Sans hadn't been exaggerating when he said the door led nowhere at all. The two of them walked through a blank. No light, no temperature, no sound that Frisk could hear save the rush of blood in his own ears. Their feet trod on something like solid ground, but no footsteps echoed in their wake. No horizon line to break earth and sky. At several points Frisk had to shut his eyes before his head started to swim. He felt untethered, like soon even gravity would fail and send him floating up into infinity. And he held onto Sans's bony hand all the tighter. Sans's unbroken pace, and the rustling blue of his hoodie, was the only landmark in the expanse. Neither of them spoke. Possibly they didn't want to know what their voices would sound like in this airless space. Frisk leaned over until his cheek brushed Sans's sleeve. He anchored himself with the sensation. They didn't know how long they walked. There was no time here. They didn't move in any particular direction. There was no direction either. But, little by little, other sounds brushed the very edges of their hearing. A distant clitter, a delicate buzz, something like a sigh. They had the feeling of being watched. Camouflage shapes dipped and swam through the skyless sky, white against brighter white. Frisk moved so close to Sans that he nearly tripped the skeleton up, but Sans just put his arm around Frisk's shoulders and kept going. They found him. They didn't see Dr. Gaster in the distance. There was no distance. Instead, as they walked, a shape slowly faded in from the blankness, as if gradually shedding layers of gauze, never becoming closer, but clearer all the same. And when he had finally solidified, and his twisted shape towered over them both, Sans finally came to a halt, and Frisk felt his bones shake beneath his grip. God. Sans' voice trembled. What did you do to yourself, WD? Dr. Gaster slumped cross-legged on the floor, arms splayed out at his sides, head askew like an unstrung marionette. He wore some dark and shapeless garment draped across his body like a shroud. The uneven pattern on the blackness and the glimpses of white fabric grinning through suggested it was a lab coat, scorched to charcoal. His head was seamless, smooth, deformed in numerous places. One eye socket pinned wide open, staring at nothing, the other a thin, down-turned crescent. His mouth another black crescent to mirror the eye. The skull split in two places, one seam running across his entire scalp in a long, unbroken line as though someone had tried to pry his head apart. He didn't look like a skeleton. He looked like a wax figurine that had passed through a blast furnace. And then there were the hands. Sprouting from Dr. Gaster's back were countless arm bones that spread across the void. They branched, they split, they rejoined again, like he had become the taproot of a macabre tree. Ranges of radii, forests of phalanges. They wavered like pale seagrass, and in their upper reaches countless hands twitched and flexed, some with fingers more delicate than toothpicks, others so massive that they could have borne up both Sans and Frisk in their palms. Hands studded with staring eyes, hands with palms split by toothy mouths, hands riveted with cameras, protractors, nameless machinery. Several arms instead terminated in monsters that dangled lifeless and gray like sad puppets, their eyes staring in blank. Frisk thought that several of them resembled people he knew, and several more resembled Dr. Gaster himself. Their joints clacked like the beaks of strange birds as they swayed. They sometimes seemed to pass through each other, or disappear into the whiteness and return elsewhere like a magician's trick. They all bent low towards Sans and Frisk with a great creaking of bone and joint. They cast no shadow, but the two of them still felt the weight of those hands. Frisk wasn't sure whether to hold on to Sans even tighter or try and hide behind him. Sans felt his tugging arm and looked over to him. Don't worry, kid. He's not dangerous. I just thought I'd have been more prepared for this. He held up his arm, forcing Frisk to stand on tiptoe. Hate to say it, but I need you to let me go now. Frisk turned pale, but slowly released his grip. Sans gave him a half-hearted wink. Then he sauntered under the canopy of Dr. Gaster's hands. Hey. Somehow his voice remained steady. Sorry I took so long. From everywhere at once came a grating, deafening wall of noise. The split palms babbled, the gray puppet shook. It sounded like sticking your head inside a malfunctioning engine, or a dial tone turned to ear-bleeding volume, or 10,000 washboards being scraped at once. Frisk cringed and clapped his hands over his ears. Yeah, I'm doing okay. Looks like you're still the same as ever, too, despite everything. Sans looked over to Frisk. Don't cover your ears when other people are speaking, kid. It's rude. Frisk lowered his hands, then winced again at the next burst of noise. He noticed that all the hands wavered in unison during that din, clacking and twisting in acrobatic contortions. Sans watched the movement intensely. Yeah, this is the one. He's not much to look at, but his determination's off the scale. Glancing at Frisk, the doctor always had some communication issues. No surprise they've gotten a little worse, given the circumstances. Don't worry, we have a system worked out. I'll interpret for you. Hands swarmed Frisk like flies. Several camera flashes went off in Frisk's face. One hand with its fingers replaced by strange sizzling rods gave his chest a gentle pinch, then flitted away. Despite the riot of movement whenever Dr. Gaster spoke or acted, his actual body remained lifeless and still. His own original hands didn't so much as twitch. Another blast of buzz. Sans nodded, then breathed deep. Okay, Frisk. The doctor wants a word with you. Frisk looked on the verge of panic. Don't worry. He won't make you say anything you don't want to. And, you might not understand, half the stuff he says, but go easy on him. He hasn't gotten to talk to anyone in a while. Ready? Frisk stared up at the forest of hands, at countless unblinking eyes, the gray puppets with their heads all tilted in expectation. He swallowed hard and nodded. All right, here we go. A wave of noise and shudder.
So,
you have arrived. Okay, starting with the obvious. I can dig it. The hands clutched and flexed. Let's not lose any time to useless introductions. Wow, bro, dial back the charm a little, why don't you? Okay, it's him talking now. Sans has already told you who I am, and I have watched you for some time. The irregularities you have created are impossible to ignore. Please do not take this as an accusation. I find your patterns admirable. Hey, you see? You've made a good first impression. Fingers snapped like wild animals. The gray puppets babbled at nothing. You created significant unrest in time and space to locate me. You put my brother through a great deal of unease. Aw man, it wasn't a problem, really. And yet, I have observed that throughout it all, and despite temptation, you continue to be yourself. I have always respected perseverance. Yeah, clearly. So, I took what limited measures I could to arrange this meeting, regardless of its eventual outcome. Now, tell me what you seek. The hands went still. Sans leaned over. That's your cue, kid. Frisk wasn't sure whether to address the hands or Dr. Gaster himself, but he knew the answer, and said it with confidence. Asriel. The hands chittered. Asriel. They seemed to laugh amongst themselves. The doomed prince. Yes, I have observed his trail as well. The deception, the tragedy, the madness, the sacrifice. The end of his life created ripples of disaster that would extend for generations to come. And after many years, Asriel will break free of that bleak existence, only to fall back into darkness. I would call it heartbreaking, had I the necessary anatomy. Yikes, WD. Working the rough chuckles there. That is the fate you wish to avert. That is why you continue to corrupt time. That is why you hold the future hostage from those who wish to live it. Frisk's ears had begun to ache from the waves of snarl and rattle crashing in on them. Numerous eyes tilted in a way that turned their stare judgmental, but he held his ground. Here is a difficult lesson for you to learn, human. All too often, happy endings are built on the misfortune of others. As cruel as it sounds, the freedom and happiness of monster kind hinges upon Asriel Dreamer's miserable end. He suffered great pain, but when given the choice, in an act of supreme selflessness, he allowed that misfortune to become the foundation of a brighter future for all. Sans' voice was toneless. He would no longer meet Frisk's eye. But you will not respect his sacrifice. You continue your efforts without hesitation. Clenching bone huddled ever closer to Frisk. I wish to hear your reasons why. Sans inhaled deep, blinked several times. Geez, that was a mouthful. Sans. Frisk still didn't back down as the hands moved ever closer, though he was shaking like a leaf. What should I do? Give him an answer, of course. Don't worry, he's just putting on his lecture hall voice. Another buzz, almost irritated. Oh, come on, WD, lay off him a little. The most brilliant mind in monster history trying to grill a grade schooler? Even I couldn't come up with something that funny. He gave Frisk a thumbs up. Just be honest, kiddo. With him and with yourself. It'll get you through every time. The hands receded, just enough to give Frisk room to breathe. He stood before Gaster like a penitent. He tried to find the words. He remembered Asriel in the flower patch, head bowed, waiting for the end. Further back, Asriel in front of the barrier, surging with the power of every soul at once, pouring all his stolen life into the thing entrapping the people he'd tormented. Further back, Asriel holding him so tight that his claws had dug through Frisk's shirt, his muzzle digging into Frisk's neck, still trying to smile as he said he didn't want to let go. Frisk said, "Did you see him too, after he changed back?" The hands turned to face one another. They seemed surprised at the question.
The point between his rise and fall. Such moments are rare in the sea of time. But yes, I have observed several.
He never smiles.
Frisk held himself tighter.
Not really.
Gaster said nothing.
I mean, he always tries, but you can tell it's not real. It's because he's scared. He doesn't want anyone else to worry.
Several hands rotated in Sans' direction. His pupils darted around. What?
I don't know him that well,
Frisk continued.
I never got the chance, but I've met him for the first time, over and over, and I think he just hates to see other people get hurt, especially after everything that happened. So when he tells me he doesn't want to leave, I think it's the same as his smile. He's telling lies.
Frisk sniffed.
Because he doesn't think there's any way to help without hurting someone else.
He rubbed his eyes and looked up.
Even if he really doesn't want to leave, I want to give him the choice. I think I'd be okay if he told me no, as long as it didn't feel like he was lying about it. But first, I need to find a way to help him without hurting anyone. As long as I can, I'm going to try.
He swallowed. His throat hurt from overuse.
But I hope he says yes. I really want him to be my friend.
He fell silent. Sans and Gaster waited to see if any more words were forthcoming, but that appeared to be the end of it. There's a warm and fuzzy feeling all through my ribcage, Sans said. Very, very nice kid. Frisk said nothing, but visibly reddened. Hey, WD, is he seriously the one responsible for sending time down the tubes? I'm starting to detect a flaw in our hypothesis here.
My model was impeccable,
Sans translated.
The anomaly persists. The darkness at the end of time cannot be avoided.
Several of the puppets tilted their heads.
But perhaps its meaning may be malleable. I had good reason to believe that the determinist meant only ruin,
but with enough determination,
it may instead
signify a new future.
One beyond the reach of any calculation.
Every hand bent low over Frisk.
There is a way.